Hello, welcome to History Changes on YouTube. I'm Dr. Philip W. Travis. I'm a professor of history. If you want to see any more information about me, I have a website, philipwtravis.com. That's with one L. There's some information up there about my bio, about publications, other interesting history stuff. I have some history and travel log information, so if you're interested in traveling and finding good history and cultural stuff, I have a segment dedicated to that, though it's under construction, so I have much to do there, but I'll have more of that coming in. So philipwtravis.com if you're interested. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about liberalism in the United States. Every 4 years we come to a presidential election, and it seems that much more apparent that Americans really have a not great understanding of liberalism. And so I thought it'd be very pertinent to talk a little bit about this. And let me start by saying, what if I told you that Bill Clinton, artistically depicted here, was actually the Democrat, much maligned by the right in the United States as being this liberal? What if I told you that Bill Clinton was actually a conservative? What if I told you that Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt, depicted here, was actually a liberal? A lot of Americans would have a hard time accepting that, probably particularly the Bill Clinton position, because Bill Clinton is oftentimes cast up as like the figurehead of liberalism today, and it's just not accurate. The reality is that Bill Clinton was a conservative, and in many respects, Theodore Roosevelt was, in fact, a liberal in the context of his time. So let's talk a little bit about why this is. So liberalism is broken into two branches. There's classical liberalism and there's social liberalism. Classical liberalism is more in line with what we call conservatives today, whereas social liberalism is much more in line with the progressives. And you can see there's lots of overlap in this. This is why I put this like this. There are very few, at least historically, there are very few American politicians who do not overlap a little bit between classical liberalism and social liberalism. And this is why you see the overlap here, and this is where you find your centrists. And the closer you get to here, the closer you get to being the center compromise, if you will, between social liberalism and classical liberalism. So a conservative in American history is still a liberal. They're just more of a classical liberal. A progressive in American history is a liberal, but what we would call a social liberal. They're not the same as the classical liberals. So let's talk about what these two sides mean. Classical liberalism is really an idea that emerges with the formation of the modern republics during the age of revolutions. We're talking about particularly the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848 that swept across Europe. Classical liberalism is really born out of individuals, the ideas of individuals like John Locke, who is artistically depicted here, as well as others like Adam Smith, Thomas Jefferson, and in the 20th century, we'd associate this with Herbert Hoover and Ronald Reagan, albeit there's many elements of their leadership periods that would be very different, of course, than the philosophical founders of those of Locke and Adam Smith. Classical liberalism is really the idea behind the formation of Republican governments, not the party. Republican as in a republic, a representative government in which a legislature voted on in one way, shape, or form, directly or indirectly by the people, oversaw the sort of system. And classical liberalism, as it emerges with the United States, with the First French Republic, and so on, classical liberalism was really an idea that was centered most around economics and the idea of individuals to prosper economically. And this was, of course, a reaction to the monarchical mercantilist system that really championed the state, but particularly the monarchy, lack of a better way of thinking about it, over the ability of individuals to profit. So the central idea of classical liberalism is really about individual rights, hence John Locke's notion of life, liberty, and land, and Jefferson amending that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The central idea of classical liberalism is to have a small government, a limited government that maximizes, within reason, individual freedom and economic freedom. In the 20th century, that notion, really moving 20th century to the present, has become associated with neoliberalism, with government deregulation policies like economic policies, environmental policies, and so forth. Neoliberalism, for those who aren't familiar with this term, of course, is a commonly referred to term, particularly in the post-Cold War era. Neoliberalism basically is a term that refers to the general approach of the United States in terms of economics and trade globally in the world. Okay, so neoliberalism was really born out of the idea that the United States could benefit, that corporations and business interests could really benefit from global free market, free trade agreements. And so neoliberalism, which is usually associated with the United States emerging as a world power, right? Neoliberalism is really this idea that as a world power, the United States would champion and enforce and put in place agreements that were consistent with free trade and sort of global economic freedom for corporations, particularly. So neoliberalism is usually associated with, things like the World Trade Organization, with global free trade agreements, which are often criticized heavily by particularly a lot of working Americans, because neoliberalism has necessitated jobs going to the places where it's the cheapest, because that's the business sense behind it. And that means that oftentimes those jobs leave the United States because of the United States' regulatory policies, both around working conditions and wages, but also environmental standards and so forth. So the modern sort of what classical liberalism looks like in the modern sense is deregulatory governing economic policies, policies that are generally opposed to unions, workers' unions, policies that generally deregulate the environment, social safety net programs, and so forth, free trade agreements and the like. So take it back to Bill Clinton. Why is Bill Clinton actually a conservative? Because Bill Clinton is actually an embodiment, really, of that era of the height of American neoliberalism and modern sort of classical liberalism. Bill Clinton had Alan Greenspan as his Federal Reserve chairman, and Alan Greenspan, who was a follower of Ayn Rand, he was a huge champion of an unregulated economic market, which contributed really significantly to the 2008 Great Recession, and to which Alan Greenspan actually apologized for. But that really embodied the sort of neoliberal or classical liberal, both approaches of the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton began austerity measures on social programs, quote unquote welfare programs. Bill Clinton signed in NAFTA, which was long a Republican sort of dream, made ultimately a final agreement by an Arkansas Democrat, Bill Clinton, but was very much consistent with Republican ideas of neoliberalism and classical liberalism. Republicans today typically are much closer to classical liberalism. Social liberalism's key advocates, as you see an artistic depiction of Martin Luther King Jr. here, very much a social liberal. Their key advocates are people like John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a philosopher. He's buried in Avignon, France, actually. If you ever go there to see the famous Palace of the Popes, you should, that's where the papacy was in the 1300s in southern France, not far from Marseille and Nice. So if you ever visit that area, John Stuart Mill's grave is right there by the old sort of city center, and it's an old medieval town. But John Stuart Mill was a utilitarian who believed that the ethical decision was the decision that benefited the most, that governing policy should be decisions that ultimately focus on social uplift, on benefiting the most over the particular maximizing of the interest of any singular individual. major Americans who are very much social liberals: Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, the champion of the New Deal, brought you programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, a myriad of types of involvement in the economy to improve the conditions for Americans as a whole. In his second Bill of Rights, his economic Bill of Rights, Franklin Roosevelt effectively said that all Americans should be owed as a right, not as we should talk about this, but as a fundamental right, the idea that they should have a home, that they should have a good job that allows for recreation, that they should have health care, that they should have access to good education. And that's just a few examples. But so Franklin Roosevelt was an example of a social liberal. Lyndon Johnson, his Great Society brought you things like Medicare and Medicaid, some of the most important reforms in terms of health care in American history, very much building on the New Deal liberalism of Franklin Roosevelt. Martin Luther King Jr., never a president, but very much a social liberal. And in one of his most famous speeches when he came out against the Vietnam War in 1967, he very much echoed these ideas of Franklin Roosevelt, of even Lyndon Johnson, who at the time, he was coming out against the Vietnam War, so it caused a great deal of turmoil between him and Lyndon Johnson. But social policy-wise, Lyndon Johnson was actually pretty strong and would have been even stronger in the war on poverty had it not been for his mistake of descending the country further and further into the quagmire that was the Vietnam War. But social liberals ultimately say, hey, the common good, it's very much in the interest of John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, that the common good is what's most important, and that the government can be a positive vehicle to improve society. The government can be a vehicle to end poverty, to provide health care, to ensure that people have access to the American dream. Social liberals like Franklin Roosevelt actually believed when he was giving his economic Bill of Rights speech in 1944, like other thinkers in American history, Franklin Roosevelt actually believed that if you didn't do these things, that if Americans did not have their most significant needs of how much they earn, their health care, their housing, that if you did not meet those needs, that these were, quote, the things that dictatorship was made of. That if you were not doing these things, like guaranteeing these things, that effectively you would be undermining what social liberals feel is like the core principle of the United States, and that core principle is justice. Justice not in the sense necessarily of how we always think about it, but justice in the sense that a just society affords people the things they need to thrive and have a high quality of life. 20th century to the present, progressivism. Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive. He was really considered the first progressive president. In many ways, the reason you can eat a hamburger today and not get sick, or at least feel reasonably confident that you won't get sick, has a lot to do with things that Roosevelt championed, like the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. He did not necessarily federally legalize or recognize unions, but he actually sided with unions in some cases, like the coal miner strike of 1902. So Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive president. Social democracy is the idea of like reforming the society to meet the best interests through lawmaking, the best interests of society. You might also call that reform socialism in some respects. It makes more sense maybe because you're passing laws to reform an unregulated system so that the needs of people are met. You can't ensure that everyone has health care and housing and jobs that pay enough to live unless you have some kind of governing sort of intervention. Where is the United States today? And this is the last slide. Today, so we live today, again, regardless of what you might hear from certain channels of society about whether it's Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, the reality is is that even though those figures are often, in media and social media circles, they're often cast in the light of like being these liberals. The reality is in the context of American liberalism, meaning the age of the figures like Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson, your so-called New Deal liberals, they're actually on the conservative spectrum. Americans today live in what historians call the era of the new conservatism or modern conservatism. And this is born largely by the election of Ronald Reagan, though the transition to this starts in the 60s. First with the campaign of Barry Goldwater, he ran against Lyndon Johnson, and then, of course, with the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. This is when you really start seeing the development of the modern conservative movement in the United States. And the modern conservative movement, again, today is associated with significant reductions in taxes, particularly for the wealthiest and for corporations, a deregulation in a number of social types of programs are often associated with this, as well as periods of environmental deregulation during this period of time. So we live in the age of the modern conservatism, a period that is far more regulated in terms of the role of capitalism in society than it was during the age of social democracy and progressivism. So when Roosevelt was president, from his presidency until the Johnson administration in the 60s, the political center of the country was probably in here. After the Vietnam War really shattered the New Deal coalition, so to speak, the center kind of moved here to somewhere between the true political center and the conservatism of maybe the most conservative president during that period. But we live in the age of modern conservatism. Despite what people might tell you, since the election of Ronald Reagan, every single president since Ronald Reagan, Democrat or Republican, has lower taxes than their predecessor, generally speaking, on the wealthiest individuals and on corporations. And any call, typically, to raise taxes on corporations or the wealthy is almost a non-starter, and that really speaks to this era that Americans are in. So today, you're in the era of the modern conservatism. The presidents, Bill Clinton is probably closer to here, maybe right here. Barack Obama is probably over here. Joe Biden's probably over here. We're in the right side of the spectrum. Okay, so you can see the spectrum goes from true political center. A far right movement comes over here towards fascism. A far left movement comes over here toward communism. So, and when in society, those ends kind of wrap around, because once you end up with authoritarian fascism or authoritarian communism, you will find in both cases a pretty extreme sort of control and repression of individual rights and benefits to individuals in society, as authoritarian states typically benefit only the top elements of society in any meaningful sense, while there's almost always a great deal of want and need over the longer term of individuals in the lower echelons of society. But today, the political center is moved to the right of the true center. And this is really embodied, again, in austerity measures on social programs, programs of social uplift, deregulation in many cases of environmental issues, certainly decisions on things like a woman's right to abortion. Those types of things is obviously an example of this shift here towards the right, as it's an example of sort of deregulating the federal power of the state. No longer is the federal government going to be the determinant on whether or not a woman can have an abortion. Now it's up to the states. The federal power has been sort of whittled away in this respect. You also see this with other areas of federal regulation. So you live in the modern conservatism today. So Bill Clinton, yeah, he's actually a conservative. All American presidents fall in the general spectrum of liberalism, right? It just depends if they're a classical liberal who believes in sort of deregulated, extremely limited government, deregulated economics to benefit sort of business and wealth, if you will, or if you're a social liberal and you believe in greater taxes and regulation on corporations and the wealthy to provide general social uplift. They're all liberals. But conservatism associated with classical liberalism, liberalism as we understand it associated with social liberalism, Bill Clinton actually finds himself over there on the right side of the spectrum. Again, free trade agreements like NAFTA, again, austerity measures on elements of quote-unquote welfare, Alan Greenspan championing the market over regulatory agencies that oversee the market, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, examples of that. And you could apply that, of course, to any of the presidents, more or less. Thanks for watching. This is History Change on YouTube. History Changes on YouTube. Philip W. Travis.